So far, we have covered the theoretical questions, calculations questions, questions with graph and figures, and also mathematical and statistical questions. Next, let us talk about the multiple choice question. A typical multiple choice question comprises two basic parts, which is commonly known as the term and also the alternatives. This term represents the problems or the questions. As for the alternatives, they are a list of suggested solutions. Taking this as an example, the term will be the question itself. The alternatives are the A, B, C, D, which are the potential solutions to the question. Among the alternatives, there are answers and distractors. Normally, there will be only one answer, and the rest are the distractor. What does it mean by the answer and distractor? The answer is the correct answer, or the best alternative among the all, while the distractor, it will be the incorrect answer or the inferior alternatives. In order to prevent argument, normally we make the answers the correct answer, while the distractor are the incorrect answers. You may use the methods of best alternative and the inferior alternatives, but you have to be careful. The best alternative will have to be really the best of all. So far, I have not really encountered this kind of MCQ, multiple choice question, but it doesn't mean that you cannot do that. Now let us look at some examples of the multiple choice questions. We learn the best practices or things that we need to consider when setting the multiple choice questions. First, this term should present the problem adequately or set a frame of reference for responding. What does it mean? You will need to make clear to the students what is being expected from the students. The questions need to be clear. You can take this as an example. This MCQ questions is an open-ended. By reading this term alone, the students do not have any idea the expectations from this question. The students will have to figure out themselves by reading through the entire questions, including all the alternatives. They will have to do some trial and errors between these terms and different alternatives in order to determine the best answer. Normally, this is not encouraged. The first principle, you are doing assessment in order to determine the levels of understandings of the students. By all means, you need to omit all the possibility that can affect the performance of the students. Assess only the understanding of the students, so that your assessment result will be more accurate. In order to prevent this, your questions will always be clear and try not to be ambiguous, since that you are trying to test the understanding of the students, and the students should theoretically have themselves prepared before taking this paper. What you really want is that by the time students complete understanding the questions, the students has already have the answer in their mind without reading through the alternatives. In fact, we would like to see this. This can only be done when you construct this term to adequately reflect the problem, which cannot be done by having this method here. You want to minimize the students guessing your intention, reading through the questions. There are elements of guessing. Here, the questions it will be more straightforward. Therefore, try not to be too open-ended for this step. Second, there should be no grammatical clues to the correct answer. If you see this question here, Albert Einstein was a, and then you have a list of alternatives. Since we have the word a here, we know that the answer definitely will not be A and B. If the answer is A and B, that should be an N. Based on the grammatical clues given, the students can omit 2 out of the 4 alternatives and increase their chances of getting the right answer. And this defeats the purpose of assessing the levels of understanding by the students. You want to minimize the chances that a student picking the answer randomly without knowing the actual answer, and yet they got the questions correct. In fact, this is going to spoil the accuracy of your assessment. That's why normally we provide an adequate amount of alternatives. Now, how can you prevent the grammatical clues here? You make sure this clue here is not to be with this term. You can group them together within the alternatives. Third, the alternative should not overlap. This is to minimize the ambiguities and arguments about the correct answers. What does it mean by not overlapping? If you see the alternatives here, you have infancy, preschool period, before adolescence. If you are talking about preschool period, this is inclusive of infancy. And if it is before adolescence, the preschool period and infancy are also included. Let's say now the answer is infancy. This makes the alternative A, B, and C are all correct. In that case, you are unable to tell if the student choose before adolescence. Does it indicate that the students truly know the answer is the infancy? Because of this uncertainty, you will have to make it more explicit. For example, from birth to 2 years old, from 2 years old to 5 years old, from 5 years old to 12 years old, from 12 years old to 20 years old, and so on so far. This will minimize the overlapping part and avoid the ambiguity. Next example. The greater similarity among the alternatives increases the difficulties of the item. What does it mean? You can compare the alternative here and the alternatives here. You will see some degree of similarity here. Jackson, Jefferson, Madison, and Washington. They all end up with son or ton. This increases the difficulties of the item, help you to filter those who do not really have an idea about the correct answer, but it feels like certain names seems to be quite familiar, and just happen that that familiarity help the students to get the answer right. Then if you have certain degree of similarity, this reduces their chances of spotting the answer. Next, we would like to keep our problems as simple as possible. Remove extra reading, which may be confusing or distracting from the questions. Taking this as an example, some information is obviously not necessary. If it is not necessary, might as well you just remove it. Now, how can you tell the relevant information is necessary? You can try to remove those information and see if this is going to affect the selections of the correct answers. If it brings no impacts to the solutions, it is likely that the relevant information is redundant. Keep it simple and straight, as your ultimate goal is to know the actual levels of understanding of the students. You do not wish to have other factors affecting the students' performance. This is especially when there are a lot of confusing words. Try to avoid that. Next, avoid using negatives. What does it mean by negative? You can see this example here. Which of the following is not in the abdominal cavity? The not here is the negatives. Now, why do we need to avoid this? The main reason is, normally we are more familiar with the positive ways of asking questions. Most of the MCQ questions are asked in the mode of positive manner. Once a while you have a negative wording. Students may have overlooked that. It is not because they do not understand. It could be simply due to they overlook the word negative. As a result, they interpret the questions wrongly, which leads to selections of the wrong answer. This is unfair to the students, and this doesn't fully reflect the actual levels or understandings of the students related to the course. Now, what if you really need to have negatives in your question? Then you will have to make sure that the students will not miss that. Taking this as an example, all the following are correct procedures for putting out a fire in a pan on the stove, except the word except here is being bold and italic. It is purposely made different from the other wordings so that the students will not miss it. In this case, you will minimize the chances that the students miss this, wrongly interpret the questions, and selecting the wrong answer simply due to overlooking of those negative terms. If you see the example 6 and example 7, the key here is not about the negative. If possible, you avoid negatives. If not, you will have to make sure the negative is being noticed by the student. The whole thing behind this is the accuracy of the assessment. You want your assessment result closely reflect the actual levels of understanding of the students. Next, avoid vague terms. You have to make sure the term adequately stating the problem. Such as this one. The term here is obviously unclear. Reading this term here, students still have no idea what the students is expected to do. Normally, we will have a full problems being clearly indicated in the term. Also, avoid wordy term by removing irrelevant data. Let's say this one, which is quite lengthy. Some information is obviously irrelevant. It is not going to be a part of the considerations. With that, you can simply remove it. You will have to make every single words in this term counts. You know that the longer the sentences in the term, the more pressure the students experience, especially when the durations of exam paper is limited. This further intensifies the psychological pressures to the students. This kind of pressure can also influence the performance of the students, and this may affect the accuracy of your measurements about the levels of understanding of the students. Next, avoid dissimilar alternatives. If possible, the alternative givens they should have similar nature under similar classifications. This is to avoid that the students who do not really know the answer but can spot for the accurate answer through other perspective of considerations, such as the classifications. If the students can remove some alternative under the classifications that obviously it is not, this will increase their chances of spotting the correct answers, and this will affect the accuracy of your assessment also. Example 11. Avoid implausible alternatives. You will need to avoid those which is obviously illogical. Let's say now you are asking about artists, but within your answers you have Santa Claus and Flintstone. These two are not the real person here, and the students will know that the obvious answer it would be either A or C. Even though the students do not know the correct answer, now the chances of spotting the questions become 50-50. In this case, if the students spot the questions correctly, but the students actually do not know the answer, this is going to influence the accuracy of your measurement.